The Enthroned, an original short story, written and narrated by Charlie C.C. Thomas. She stood in her mother's old room, staring at the little box in front of the vanity mirror. Her mother had bought it at a yard sale when she was a girl, and for next to nothing. It was long, slender and cheap, one of a million like it off the production line, but the stain and varnish outside, having once made it look solid and sturdy, now it flaked off at the edges and was milky. Red and brown paint was splattered like mist over one side. It always helped keep her eye away from it as a girl, like it were just a painter's box. But it wasn't. She knew it, her brother knew it, and her mother, well, knew that they knew. It's funny how silence can be so loud, she thought and sighed, blinking against the sunlight of the mirror. Her guts swam around one another as her heart raced up into her mouth. She chewed her cheek and set her hand on the vanity, eyes wet and threatening to spill over. Her chest clenched. She pulled her hand away and spun, inhaling as she wiped up her forehead and over her tightly pulled hair. She shut her eyes, hands falling to the hips of her pantsuit as she breathed through her nostrils. Her mother flashed in the dark behind her lids, round-faced and deep eyes with long dark hair. Her mother smiled wide and laughed, the sound forgotten but the memory as crisp as film. Her eyes opened, wet and weeping as she stood straight and clenched her jaw, ignoring the choke in her throat to undo her bun. Her hair fell below her shoulders in a mass of black waves and curls as she spun, blunt fingernails scratching her scalp as she faced the box. She stepped forward, hands down and eyes ignoring her reflection that looked too much like her mother. She swallowed and stopped in front of the vanity, shaky hands hovering over its surface. She set her jaw and glared at the box, shaking her hands like she were about to fight, and pressed her palms into the wood. The feel of the grain reached inside her and twisted her heart with 100 memories of stealing her mum's makeup, of crying while her mother brushed her hair before school, of watching her mother sing to herself while getting ready. She swallowed around a sob in her throat, choking down the tightness in her chest. Her eyes spilled over, mouth quivering, as quivering hands reached for the box. A whimper fell between her lips when she touched it, and the world blurred through her tears. She clamped her throat shut, caging her sob and jerking the box toward her, scraping it over the vanity until it shook and the box stopped against her thighs. She breathed a shaky breath, eyes still glued on the spot the box had been, as her fingers toyed with its brass latch, polished from daily use, flipping it loose and shut, over and over as she chewed her cheek. She swallowed, dry mouth parting and lips sticking together as the smell caressed her face. Her eyes shut and more tears trekked her cheeks, dragging her makeup with it. Her head fell, shoulders shaking in a silent sob as she saw her mother's shut bedroom door as a girl. Every day at 3 p.m., while she ate her lunch, the smell of the herbs would roll from under the door, then the smoke, then her mother's voice, the special voice, the one she only used when she was in her bedroom at 3 p.m. She opened her eyes on her reflection and cursed, pulling a tissue from her pocket and dabbing her eyes. She cursed again, face and throat flush, as she huffed and wiped away the dry rivers of eyeshadow and mascara. She crumpled the tissue in her hand and leaned on the vanity, mouth tight, then open with words she didn't have for her mother's reflection. She ground her teeth and shut her eyes, shaking her head with a sigh. "You know," she whispered, grabbing the box and turning around. "You know, you could have called me Mum." It was low, but the quiver was gone, heated with each word that came next. "I mean, it's not like I was a bad daughter, right?" She sat cross-legged at the foot of her mother's bed, avoiding the grate as she stared at the box, its contents laid bare. She picked up the glass jar of green and purple leaves and shook it, scowling. I called you. I visited you. We made dinner every Sunday. I even got stupid Johnny to join us. She opened the lid, and the smell smacked her. She wrinkled her nostrils and stared, sighing, picking up the slender pipe her mother had made from a dead branch in the park. I even ignored your weird rituals. I acted like I didn't know about your medicine book, like I didn't understand all the stuff you plastered around the house after I moved out. She sighed and let her hands fall into her lap, hunching as she turned to the top left drawer of her vanity. I bet your book's still there. Only now you can't stop me from looking for it. Her throat tightened, and she swallowed it down, shutting her eyes as she faced the bedroom door across from her and opened them on her lap. You weren't much into drugs, she thought, but I could use something. And at least you had this. I guess I get to see what all the fuss was over. She pinched the dried herbs and pressed them into the chamber, compacting another on top of it before she clicked on the torch and set the leaves to flame. She puffed, letting the smoke drift out her mouth until the herbs became embers. She breathed deeply, letting the smoke fill her and sink into her veins. She let it out on a cough, the sting dry and angry as she gasped for a clean breath and waved her hand in front of her face. God, this stuff smells... She stopped, blinking with a coughing chuckle at her voice. Is that my voice? It deepened with each breath, like she were trying to sing bass. She smiled around her mother's pipe and breathed deeply, eyes fluttering shut as the smoke filled her, the burn a dull warmth as she let it settle. Sunshine pulsed out with every heartbeat, her skin going flush and eyes heavy as she let out the smoke. She slumped against the bed, champing her teeth and chuckling at how she could feel the roots, at how cold the metal grate of the bed was, at how soft the area rug beneath her was. She let the smoke out and swayed, hair caught in the grate and pulling, strands ripping free. Her eyes shut in a long blink before she breathed from the pipe, and let them close as the warmth spread with her blood, trickling into her head, as the edges of the world blurred black and white. She smiled wide. No wonder you did this every day, Mum. Her voice was deep, echoing in her ears, making the air ripple as she set the pipe back in the box and stared at the door. She tilted her head and squinted at the unlocked handle, sighing and sending the air into a sputter of winding ripples like heat waves. She smiled at it, chuckling and sending a wave through the air again, there and not, like the imprint light leaves in the eye. She swayed to her hands and knees and crawled to the door, grunting and laughing at herself until she reached it, bent her arm near in half and turned the lock on the handle. She slumped to the cool hardwood, back to the door as her pantsuit slid, sending her forehead crashing into her forearm. She giggled at herself and shut her eyes, body sinking into the floor as the warmth pulsed through her like it had its own heartbeat. She opened her eyes as the floor shifted and the air stirred, blinking up at the dim moonlight that bleached the world. She furrowed her brow and blinked a long time, opening her eyes on her mother's bedroom and the lid of the open box. She swallowed and drifted deeper into the floor, body melting as tears welled and she breathed words she didn't know how to say. Finally, she said, "Where are you, Mum?" She stared at the box, sighing at the silence and the dark as she spread out over the floor, the air bristling cold on her hot skin. Sweat beaded on her brow and down her back. She swallowed, eyes drifting down to the floor as memories tried to spark and fluttered out. Her hands stretched out in front of her, fingers getting longer and shorter the more she looked at them, like it were through warped glass. She stilled. Her hand was long and twisted, shifting, like light under water, until the skin split and the darkness wrapped around the air. There was another hand wrapped in hers, another arm leading into the air above, and a face, her mother's and not, and it was surrounded by lace and silk and oak. It was her, but it wasn't her face. Not anymore. Tears fell, and she closed her eyes, heart pounding beside and pulsing warmth like a distant ache. The lid of the box slammed shut. Her eyes jolted open, and the night was swallowed by inky black. The moonlight was gone. The silhouettes of furniture were gone. The cool hardwood was gone. The only thing left was a sparkle of the box's remaining varnish, tiny and distant as a star. She flexed her hand and furrowed her brow as something slid between her fingers, pulling them close and stopping. The floor was cooler and softer, wrapping around her fingers like she were dragging it through water. She pushed herself up, and her skin slid through the upper layers of the floor, looking down at herself and sighing when there was nothing but black. She reached down, grazing the surface of the floor in front of her, pressing down. It slid between her fingers, moving out of her way like mist, but clinging to her skin like ink. No, she thought. Thicker, like blood. She pushed, and her hand sank beneath the surface, surrounded by coolness. She yanked it back. There wasn't a splash, a ripple, nor the smell of trailing vapor. She held her hand up, waiting for the droplets of water to fall down her forearm, but they never came. Her hand pushed back into the floor until it was swallowed. She plunged down and sank to just above her waist before the substance firmed, hard enough to resist the pressure while conforming to her shape. She jerked her hand away and cleared her throat. The sound echoed off invisible walls, trailing further and further out like an endless sea until it faded to nothing. She swallowed and looked around, reaching back for the door, but there was only the dark. She turned and wiped her brow, the stagnant air warm and wet, sticking to her tongue with bitter breath. She closed her mouth and breathed through her nostrils, pushing onto her knees and waiting as she sunk beneath the surface and found the firm bottom. She gripped her knees and pushed to her feet, waiting as she settled against the floor. "What kind of trip is this?" Her voice echoed, further and further until it was swallowed by distance. She spun until the twinkle of the box was at her back, feeling the air for the door again, the wall, the chair beside, for anything. Her arm fell, skin on skin, dragging her eyes as she felt across her naked body, shivering. She turned her head to the box's twinkling light and pressed her lips together, creeping forward, wading through the misty floor. She looked down. The light should be enough to show something, and only found darkness. So she pressed on, furrowing her brow as the light never got closer. It should have only taken a few steps to reach the box, but she'd gone 5 times that. 10. She clenched her fists and looked over her shoulder for the darkness she'd come from, before facing the darkness she was headed to. She walked, and walked, and walked, and walked. After a small eternity, the light looked closer, shimmering white with wispy lines branching out like crinkles in paper. She furrowed her brow at the colour and quickened her pace, heart thrumming and lips parted on bitter air as she slipped into a sprint. "Come on," she thought, "a little closer." A little longer, and she could hold something from the real world. A little closer, and she would have something other than the misty floor and darkness. She smiled as the light came brighter, closer, colder. Maybe this is just a tunnel. She held her hand up and found the silhouette in the dim light and the vague shape of her body when she looked down. She smiled and launched into a run, laughing as she flew, fast, faster and faster than she'd ever run before. She looked down and the floor moved in the dim light. A sea of white smoke, heavy, rippling with her feet, arcing back into itself like hot wax in oil. It parted around her, wave cresting either side of her in a wild, silent spray that drifted through the air like dust on the moon. She found the light, so close, and her laugh echoed, rippling across the white smoke. Something moved. She looked right, smile falling like a corpse as the heavy smoke swirled and shifted over her long, winding body. She stopped, and the ground quivered around her legs, lifting her up in dwarven hills before settling back flat. The thing swam under the surface, creeping through the smoke like it slithered through honey, big as a river. Her heart pounded with each giant swooping arc of its body, covering her in sweat, ears ringing in the thick silence. It stopped. She went cold, sweat weeping down her body as wide eyes glued themselves to the settling hills of pale vapor. Her foot slid back as the floor fell flat and calm. Whatever it was had plunged beneath the firm floor, its massive weight carrying it down, down, down. She swallowed and stepped closer to the light, chills running up her body as something echoed from the darkness. A long, distant hum, low, breathy, and too close, fluttering on the air, running up her back and vibrating her bones. She shook off the cold breath and walked, slow and steady and careful, until the light was a yard away. A tiny white constellation glowed, each star point bridged by threads like cracks in the fabric of the darkness itself. She breathed a sigh of relief and sped forward, hands out to grab them. They weren't the box, but they were something other than smoke and blackness and that thing. Something hard crashed into her. She scrunched her face and fell back, the floor rippling around her as she blinked the tears from her eyes and felt her nose. She groaned and propped herself up, rising to her knees and shuffling to the lights. Her fingers hovered over them, cold wind whistling through before it pulled back, sucking warm air around her hand. She swallowed and touched the light, hand spreading on a wall, solid as stone, tracing her fingers over the little stars and their glittering strings. Holes. Her fingers fell into the tiny divots as cold air whistled through, high and sweet, before rushing back and taking warm air with it around her hand. She traced the cracks connecting the holes, and snatched her hand away with a hiss, fingers shooting to her mouth and sucking the blood away as a small patch of crimson shone on the spiderweb of light. She furrowed her brow at it, crouching as another finger grazed an opening large enough to fit her pinky through. Frigid wind bit her skin as she slipped her little finger inside, wriggling it and hissing as the edges nicked her knuckles until it was flush to the rest of her hand. Wind racked her digit, numbing her skin as it twisted around her flesh, groping it, pulling hard as the warm air fled the other holes. Then it pushed, flattening her pinky against the other side of the wall as freezing air whistled through the cracks. She pulled her finger back, carefully sliding against the stone until it was free. She held it up. Her skin was paler than the rest as snow melted and fell down her forearm in the steamy floor. She flexed her hand, shaking it, tucking it under her arm until the feeling came back. It's not very thick, she thought, smiling. Maybe I could get through, if I ram it with something. But what's on the other side? She knelt, licking dry lips despite the bitter air, and looking through the hole rimmed with her drying blood. Rolling hills of white and grey stretched on forever beneath a pale shifting sky as snow danced on the air like fairies. The wind pulled through the holes, rushing warm air past her eye as she squinted against the muddled blur of the world beyond. The wind changed, Snow swirled together in a cyclone and fell through the hole, blasting her eye and sending her back with a hiss. She blinked the cold and snow away, groaning at the sting and grinding her teeth. The ground trembled and shifted beneath her, sending chills up her spine. The low hum broke through the darkness again, and it wasn't very far this time. She swallowed and put her arm back to the wall, wide, sore eyes scanning the small world lit by the tiny lights. Everything was still, flat, and calm, but the sound came again, and closer. She turned back to the wall and groped, standing as she felt for the edges, and stopping when she couldn't see the floor anymore. The sound came again, closer and lower, reverberating like a growl. She spun and raced beside the wall, past the holes, hand on the black surface in hopes of an end, and stopped at the edge of the light. She looked back to the small beams cast across the pale mist, panting. The sound came again, closer. She gritted her teeth and faced the darkness, edging further from the light, tiptoeing beside the wall and praying to find the edge. She looked over her shoulder, only a few meters into the black. She nodded and breathed, forging deeper, groping the wall and looking over her shoulder. Still not too far. She took a deep breath and pressed on, swallowing, gnawing her cheek. The sound exploded from the darkness a few 100 feet away. She jumped, slamming into the wall, heart pounding, body thrumming, sweat falling hot against the cool, hard blackness behind her. The ground vibrated, moving in slow ripples as she swallowed and became a statue. Something big slid through the ground in the darkness, wading deeper through the floor, down and up and slithering side to side. A giant mouth sprung to life in her head, full of razor teeth that salivated for her. Its gaping throat would pull her in, and she'd beg to be suffocated before its stomach dissolved her alive. The ground in front of her foot rose, pushing her up with it like a solid tide until she was 3 feet higher. Her hair slid between her back and the wall, catching above her in matted locks as she slowly descended. Her eyes went wide, jaw clenched, breath frozen in her chest as the smoke parted in massive arches. The firmer ground beneath was glossy black where the light could touch it, rising and falling in waves and ripples, hills and trenches, and inside it was a giant slithering thing. It wasn't a solid color, more a muted, muddled rainbow like a puddle of gasoline. It didn't have scales or fur, maybe even skin, with a long, fat body rippling like a giant muscle. The sound came again as she slowly sank, and her eyes flitted up as the smoke exploded. Something like a head on a serpentine neck breached, with a low cry that made her flesh rumble on her bones. She covered her ears, squinting as the sound scratched at her eardrums until the thing looked toward the light. Its head was long and sharp as a knife, wide where it met its body and ending in a conical point. 100 tiny eyes surrounded the base of a dozen massive horns, growing all around its neck and pointing back to its worm-like body. 4 mandibles came undone, each moving on its own like a snake's jaw and rearing up like misshapen limbs, each lined with hundreds of tiny hooked teeth in its black, drooling flesh. A long black-blue tongue slithered from its throat and tasted the air with a low hum. It screamed, loud and long enough to make her teeth ache from the vibration. Then it twisted its head and thrust back into the floor with a muffled crash and tear like a sword burying into a pillow. She stood frozen as the ground rippled, carrying her up and down against the wall, hands stuck over her ears, and dry eyes aching until the world went still and silent once more. She swallowed, and the sound of it screamed in her ears. She whirled around and smacked the wall, breath finally vomiting out as her heart pounded in her temples, her throat, her limbs. Her eyes flicked around and she found the light. She ran through the dark and the ground shook. She froze as the low rumble vibrated the air, crouched and leaning on the wall to keep from moving. Even her eyes went still, watching from the corner for any movement. When none came, she swallowed and took a step. She waited. No vibration. She took another step and waited. There was no worm. She took another and another and tiptoed forward, licking her lips against the bitter air until she could crouch in front of the light. She touched the wall, colder than when she first found it, and swallowed, pushing against the hard surface. If that thing can swim through the floor, she thought, maybe I can push through the wall. There's holes in it. Something put it there, right? Probably the worm, she thought to herself. She ignored her thoughts and pushed, hissing as she fought to keep every sound quiet as possible, stopping when the ground vibrated and rippled and took her a few inches higher than before. She pushed, but it was solid as brick. She beat her fist against it, and the clap struck the air like a harp, sharp and twangy. She froze, and the ground stirred. She closed her eyes and breathed through her nostrils, hand opening on the holes and sliding down to the cold wind blasting through them. Her finger caught the edges and wormed inside, to the cold and snow. She swallowed and hooked her fingers, pulling, prying, fighting against the urge to grunt or scream when it wouldn't come free. The air pulled through the hole, whistling high and sharp against the low hum. Her eyes went wide and she flattened her hand over them, hissing as her flesh sucked through with the negative pressure, biting her palms, cutting her skin on the edges. She hissed, squeezing her eyes shut and jerking her hands back. The wind howled into the holes and stopped. She spun with a whimper and watched the darkness, but the small lit world was flat, and nothing hung at the edges of the oblivion. She shut her eyes and turned back around as cold air trickled through, sputtering in sharp breezes as she hooked her fingers on the edges and pulled. She pulled and pried and shoved against the cracks, but it was like flattening a steel cube with your hands. She slammed her palms into the wall with a grunt, and the ground shook. She looked over her shoulder, and her stomach dropped. The mist stirred. She spun back round, grabbing the holes in the wall, hissing through her teeth as the floor rippled and rose in tides. She panted, groping for the holes as the world jostled her up and down, growling and pounding the wall. The air became thin and cold as another wintry blast erupted from the holes. The mist swam around her. She looked behind, and the ground shifted and slithered at the edges of the light. She whimpered and spun back, balling up her fists and beating the wall until crimson glowed in the dim light. She looked over her shoulder, and the mist parted, the ground rising in a sudden wave as the knife-point snout of the giant worm breached, jumping into the air. Its four-way slitted mouth slunk open and filled the void with a roar that pushed her against the wall, stabbing into her ears and drowning out her own screams. She crawled to her hands and knees as the lights were banished under the wave of ground and scrambled after them, plunging her hand through the liquid smoke and sinking up to her forearm in the firm floor. She pried it open with a strange shout, still swallowed by the worm's roar, but it clung to itself like wet clay and snapped shut around her finger. She pounded the ground, the wall, screaming and cursing as she slowly descended enough to see the first hole in the wall. She glowered as the roar died, ears ringing, body thrumming with the memory of vibration. "Let me pass!" Her scream cut the air. The ground shook. The wall trembled and the wind howled and burst through the holes, cutting her skin like a sandblaster. She screamed and fell back, cradling her bleeding hands, and the cracks branched into a spider web. One arm would jolt forward with white light, cracking the air like breaking glaciers as another followed, and the next, until rivers of shadowed darkness stretched up and out in a blur of grey, filling the whole black world with dim light. She sat up, looking into the endless sky after the growing wall of frozen electricity, and swallowed as the wind died. She crawled closer, looking over her shoulder and the towering thing. It blinked against the light, jaws snapping independently and hissing, shaking its massive head against the sudden cold and lurching back through the sea beneath the mist. She turned back, and a chip of the black fell at the edges of the holes, then another, and a dozen. The wall sparkled, and 1,000 tiny pieces sloughed off and fell like shooting stars, flashing silver then black and silver again as they turned over in the light. They smacked through the mist with muffled crashes. Then the air was pulled through the wall. It sucked until her hair flew in her face, and the shifting floor of the darkness rose and rippled with the air current. The worm roared at the wall, looking up into the blur of eternity before its massive tail burst through the floor miles away, tossing tons of floor and mist in slow, hovering arches and waves. It screamed, loud and desperate as new cracks formed, roaring back like fractured ice and snapping wire. The air stopped, replaced by screaming wind from the thousands of tiny holes in the wall, cracking it, sending 1,000 more little pieces free, making the holes larger by the second. It groaned like a diving submarine, and it buckled. She jumped up, stepping back as the wall pulsed under the force of the wind, light burning through the millions of cracks from frozen lightning. She smiled and pushed her hair back. "Yes," she whispered, and the cracks doubled with a cry. "Yes, let me through." The wall groaned and the wind switched, rushing into the holes hard enough to pull her forward. "Let me through!" She stood against the pull of the wind. "Let me in! Let me in!" The wall buckled, boulder-sized sections sliding in as light broke through. "Come on, open up!" she screeched before the worm screamed and thrashed. "Oh, shut up!" She spun and jumped back when she found its body only 100 meters away. She turned back to the wall and shrieked, "Open! Let me through! Please!" The wall screamed and collapsed. Huge sections broke free and flew into the cold beyond, letting a hurricane of wind rush through and drag the cracked darkness into the white world. Piece by piece the wall crumbled into the cold, disintegrated into boulders and rocks and dust as she screamed for it to open, as the worm swam closer. It rose, miles above the ground, its body a kaleidoscope of strange colours and rippling strands of muscle and bone. "Hurry!" she screamed. The holes in front of her broke open, jerking her face toward them as 100 little shards were sucked into the white void, 100 more and 100 more. "Julie," her mother's voice came with the wind. Before she could speak, the air pulled her forward with a grunt and scream as she tumbled through the hole and was eaten by bitter cold. She fell through the air and over freezing ground and snow, grunting with each time she smacked the floor of the world. She slammed into a pile of snow at the base of a massive black boulder, blinking against the wind as she found the way she'd come, a mass of black cracks in thin air. She groaned, rolling in the snow and pushing herself up against the black stone. She slipped and fell face first into the white floor. She huffed through her nose, pushing up with both hands and grabbing the jagged side of the boulder, pulling onto her knee and pushing up. Her leg gave out with a gasp and sent her tumbling down the slope of a hill with a cry, rolling over herself and stopping at the bottom. She pushed herself onto her back to see if the boulder would follow. It remained unmoved, and groaned, puffing out a cloud as her skin rose in a forest of goosebumps. The cold seeped into her, numbing the ache and bruises as she shuffled onto her elbows, to one side, to her haunches, and wrapped her arms around her legs. She shivered, heavy eyes falling shut as her head slumped into her knees. No. She snapped her eyes open at her mother's voice, looking around at the nothingness. She looked at the top of the hill, and the black stone, the Stygian lightning swallowed by the grey sky and whipping winds. Snow rose into the air like a wave, falling down and burying her in a cold blanket. She gasped and shivered, sloughing off the snow as she peeked through heavy eyes at the endless plain before her, rising here and there in low hills with a blurry horizon. She smiled and fell back down. No monsters. The wind scraped her back and pulled a gasp from her. She curled around herself and shook, teeth chattering as she pushed the snow away and shimmied into a shallow hole to block the wind. Something hard and rough grazed her side, stone or rocks or frozen soil. She turned her head to look, hand brushing the ground. No. She stopped at the sound of her mother's voice coming from the edge of her hovel. She sat up and looked round, wind beating her numb face as she spun. She brushed her hair away, stopping at the still figure beside her, turning to face it, blinking against the white and furrowing her brow up at her mother. It was her mother's face, but she looked like a picture cut from a book. The sapphire dress and blushed cheeks the only lively colour in the white, the long black hair like a void as it hung past her shoulders. Her mother was unreal, like the sun in the night time, bright yet everything still dark. Mum's not moving, she realized. The wind whipped, grabbing her hair, biting her skin, picking up and flinging the snow, but her mother was untouched and still amidst the chaos. Mum? Her voice came out a whisper. No, her mother said, crawling closer and cupping her face. Her mother was so warm, so real. She grabbed the warm hand and held it close, face leaning into her mother's palm, and thumbs stroking absently as she warmed against the pale skin like it were candle flame. Mummy, she whispered through a tender, scared smile. No, Julia, her mother repeated. Her eyes flew open at her name. She never called me that. Her listless fingers froze as she sat still as a deer in the road, eyes glued forward so she could see only her mother from the blurry edge. Don't rest, babe. She floated up at her mother's face, eyes watering and chest twisting into a scrap of tattered metal. It was her voice. It was her face and hair and clothes. She had her smell, her sad smile, her deep eyes. Don't sleep, her mother continued. Don't think. Run. Fight. Kill. Whatever you have to do, just don't stay here, Julia. You'll die. Her mother's smile wilted into a lifeless frown, vibrant eyes clouding as she sighed. Her hand trembled against Julia's skin. Her clothes, her hair, once so still against the wind, swayed at its touch. Her skin chilled in the air, eyes flicking back and forth like she realized where she was, lips parting over clenched teeth. She panted and locked milky eyes with Julia, pulling her hand away as the wind grabbed her dress and hair and flung them around. Her mother reached into her mouth, clawing at something with a groan as her skin went pale. She whimpered. Fingers caught on something silver as Julia sat like a statue, heart racing and face screwed up. Confusion, disgust, fear all clattered and chattered around her. Her mother snipped something between her teeth and her jaw fell open with a desperate sigh. Her white eyes watered as she grabbed Julia's shoulders, squeezing like she were a lifeline. "Run, Jules!" she screamed, shrill and desperate as tears fell around a choking sob. Julia trembled as her mother's face shrunk, skin hugging closer to her bones, eyes receding into the shadow of her orbits. "Run!" She pushed Julia back, crawling after her, hoisting her up into the hungry wind. "Mum!" Julia tried to face her through their dance of hair, but her mother turned her around and pushed, grunting, sobbing as her fingers shrunk on Julia's arms and her strength fell. "Run, Jules! Don't come back! Run, and don't look behind you! Don't come for me or save us! Just go!" Her mother gasped and groaned, falling into the snow with a crunch. Julia turned and trembled as her mother's body wasted away in front of her. Her dress was dull and grey, shredded as the molesting wind grabbed and tore, her long black hair whipped over the snow, coming free in stolen locks by the wind. Her skin shriveled to paper, hugging closer to her bones until she was a shrunken grey husk. Her lips peeled over her teeth in a permanent snarl as the nose blackened and her eyes withered to dust. She breathed, mumbling a word, "Run," before the wind slammed into Julia's back, pushing her to the ground as it swept up the snow in a wave. Her mother screamed in the white, drier and more of a bestial gurgle by the second. Julia pushed herself up, body burning in the cold as she screamed for her mother, launching to her feet and running after the sound. She leapt down a hill, lungs burning, eyes half frozen, numb limbs blue. Her mother's skeletal body spun in the wind, screaming like her throat was slit, and the snow took shape. 100 little things grabbed her, gnawed the air, snapping for her, chattering in the whistle and howl of the wind as her mother wept. "Run, Jules!" Her mother managed a few words. "Run away! Don't come back!" Then the snow fell, and her mother was jerked through the air like she were on strings, jolted down to crash to the floor of the world. "Mum!" The wind howled and laughed at her as she fumbled and fell, crawling to the rim of the crater and shoveling snow aside with her hands, spraying it behind, beside, in white arches. She panted, eyes wide, chest burning and limbs numb as tears welled, fell and froze on her face. She grimaced, face tingling and burning, and dug as the wind swirled around her, pushing the snow back in as it laughed at her. She shoveled and panted and sobbed, body heaving as she looked at her purpling hands and trickling bloody cuts that she couldn't feel, staining the snow. Her lips peeled back as her eyes shut, squeezing her hands into fists and standing up on her knees to vomit a scream. She gasped when her lungs were empty, falling back to her heels and slumping forward, shaking from the cold and sobs alike. "Don't go," she whispered between breaths. "Please, don't leave me again. Mummy, don't leave me. Mum." She gasped around a frozen sob, bloody hands covering her face, shocking her skin like ice. She shook and quivered, teeth chattering as she looked up and leaned on her hands and knees, vomiting another cry. Then a whimper, then a groan as she bowed into the cold white. The wind surrounded her, chattering, grabbing at her hair, gnawing around her, desperate to make her like her mother, to pull her through the sky and turn her into a frozen, mummified corpse, to bury her beneath the snow and laugh and taunt. It grabbed her hair and pulled it into a knot that flopped back and forth, whipping her numb skin as she trembled for a breath, and pushed herself up, wrapping her arms around her body and scanning the landscape. White hills rolled over white hills behind a curtain of snow, caught up in a whirlwind around her. It spun faster and faster, catching up the snow into a white wall that blasted her eyes and made her whimper. She pushed up to her feet and turned round. "Run!" her mother's voice screamed in her head. "Run away, Jules! Julia shivered, cursing when her ankle rolled under her. She stumbled and panted, looking down at the purple skin and flopping the near lifeless appendage. Nothing. She stood on her sprained or broken ankle and snivelled, coughing up cold air as sweat broke across her skin. The cold burned, snow turning into solid fire, baking her skin where it touched, cooking her insides even as the sweat turned to slush and ice on her skin. The wind fell down her nape like the breath of a hungry monster, its maw opening, waiting for her to fall back so it could lap her up and swallow her whole. She shook her head and took another step, ignoring the grind and crunch when she put weight on her right foot, ignoring the blood froze into her skin, ignoring the cold worming up into the roots of her teeth and the flesh of her eyes. She whimpered and breathed out a shuddering cloud of breath as the wind ran up her back, swimming around her like 1,000 hungry hands that touched all of her. Something joined the wind, low and distant like a creaking door or old floorboards. She looked over her shoulder and the whirlwind had grown, stretching out like a hurricane and turning the hilly world behind her into a white screaming haze. But at the edge of the world, from out of the blur of the horizon, a shadow crawled over the white blanket. It slunk closer, growing tall and wide like a yawning mouth until it was 100 yards away. The shadow of an archway loomed over her, rigid and uncaring of the snow, black as night beside the frozen world and covered in living wood grain that swam like rippling water. She teetered to face it, and the hinges groaned. Chains clattered, and the seal of the doors broke, blowing out warm air. The wind stopped. The world went silent beside the turning hinges and clanking chains, but even that ended after a deep thud. Then the air was swallowed in still, cold silence, and the doorway stretched over her, warm breath whispering for her to come in. She stepped closer, body tingling in the steady, warm air. She shut her eyes and grimaced against the sting in her feet and fingers as black-blue flesh came alive and realized parts of it were dead. She swallowed, ignoring the burn and sting of lost flesh to stumble forward on the steaming breath of the darkness. "Will you take me back to the other place?" she whispered, her voice dry and hoarse, a stranger's to her ears. She stopped under the archway, feet screaming against the warm stone floor as black flesh died beneath her. She groaned and let her arms fall, eyes squeezing shut, teeth bared, and new tears falling down blistered cheeks. Something shifted on the stone, and her eyes flew open, the worm rearing up in the back of her mind. But it wasn't the worm, and it wasn't the other place. The longer she looked inside the doors, the more her eyes adjusted to the dim sconces and the little light from the snowy world beyond. There were no walls either side the doors in the snow, but beyond was a jade hall, its floors, walls, and vaulted ceiling a river of light and dark green beside black speckles. Arches lined the hall, left and right, yawning with onyx curtains beyond, the decorative columns and their lintels brown marble, carved with thousands of jade vines and flowers of jasper, opal, bloodstone, onyx, topaz, and quartz alike. Between the vines golden stems grew from the columns, unfurling into large leaves that held a single fat candle. Julia stepped onto the jade, jaw still tense as she looked into the gloom of the high ceiling, shadows dancing over distant figures, like angels and gargoyles from the flickering candle flame. She spun, eyes darting away from the blistering light of the white world through the doors. Something shifted over the stone at the back of the hall, drawing her eyes as she whirled around on aching, burning feet. She stopped and blinked, wincing at the strain, like talons tugging at her eyes. The hall was short, maybe a few dozen meters, with an alcove at the end, and shadowed throne backlit by dim candles, but at the same time was also longer and wider and taller, and also more than even that. It never flickered or grew or shrank. It never blinked between one size or another. It never moved, yet it was always moving. It was like the hall stretched on for miles, then slapped to only a few feet away over and over again, without ever changing. It was like sitting in a parked car and having the cars either side move at the same time. It was like falling in a dream without ever jerking awake in your bed. She grimaced and looked away to a yawning arch to her right. Left foot forward and hand out to steady herself. The room spun, sideways and backwards. It grew and shrank. The vines slithered like snakes over the archways, but they never advanced. The leaves blew in an unfelt breeze. The sconces shifted and warped, but their candles never spilt. The world twisted in and out of itself as she gasped and blinked long and slow against the broken space. Or was it just an illusion like everything else? Her stomach wormed into her mouth as sweat beaded on her brow, making her shiver in the warmth and wince as sweat trickled into the cracked skin. Jules. Her eyes flew open and darted down the hall, ignoring the vertigo and nausea, to flit over the shadowy throne after her mother's voice. There was nothing, just the seat and curtains of shadow and a golden mask hanging above the stone seat. Ivory, granite, pale jade. It swam in the shadows with ripples of black and silver like stained Damascus steel. Julia! She stiffened and shivered as her mother's call came from the darkness in the throne. The shifting shadows swam like silk in the wind, folding over themselves until it was solid and left the throne uncovered and exposed the pale sconces behind, making everything a dim silhouette. Julia swallowed as the golden mask moved with the darkness, arranging itself into a shape. It wasn't quite human or animal. It was something of both, of neither, and something else entirely. It sat in the throne, a mass of black liquid darkness, leaning forward to better look at Julia. A mane of copper locks fell over its shoulders and weighed down the shifting, floating robes of silken darkness. Its stare petrified her, guiding her eyes to its face, its mask, like the lulling hymns of a nursery rhyme. Bottomless black sockets locked with her brown gaze, surrounded by golden sculpted fur. Its smile, wide enough to split the oval mask in half, was full of crimson fangs, snarling happily like a clever fox. But the edges were smooth, hemmed in white crimson and gold, with a tiny vine slithering between the seam of fur and hem. Julia, the thing said in her mother's voice, shifting, filling the hall like it were a great fat beast slumping over the ground, here a mile away, there an inch all at once. She blinked, feet frozen on the warm jade, as she swallowed and said, "Where's my mother?" It tilted its head, bottomless eyes gleaming like it had chuckled. Then it spoke with 3 voices, one her mother's, and 2 strangers. "There are some who try to kill us," it hummed amusedly. "Those are collected by death, or else join us here. Always." It whispered the last, black hands, claws, gripping the stone arms of the throne as it leaned forward to gloat and squint and chuckle, the mask still his eyes. "There are those who would flee," it said with a dozen voices. "But they are not half so lucky to outrun us. I do find their screams most delightful, however." Where's my mother?" Julia shrieked, heart thrashing like a desperate bird. It laughed and shifted, sliding on the stone like a giant snake until it stood and descended the steps to its throne, hidden in the black robes. Each footfall was elegant as a prowling tiger, filling the hall with shifting and sliding like it dragged something heavy under it. "Why, she's here! With all of us!" Its body moved like a man, but rolled like a hungry predator. It was rigid as bone, but languid as the black silks covering it. It was graceful and stunted. It was heavy as iron, yet wafted through the air like snow. It made tears well in her eyes, sockets burning, fire boring into her skull the longer she stared, unable to look away. Cold filled her mouth, crawling up her back in goosebumps as she breathed. Who? It mimicked her voice. "So often we're called what? You flatter us." It crossed the hall, the impossibly long, impossibly short hall, in 5 strides, its silks trailing behind, clinging to the front of a skeletal body that might have been human. No. It stood, loomed over her, a gaunt giant, a spider, an emaciated cat surrounded by swirling shadow. "We've decided what you are, Julia. You're our most cherished of the fruits of terror." It stooped, arms weaving through its robes, long, bony things with leathery skin, ending in curled nails. Inside, the robes flapped apart enough to show the withered, emaciated husk of something like a man, like the twisted shadow of a child's memory of something awful. The bony, diseased fingers traced her cheek as she shivered, body stitched in place, breath ragged. It took her chin between its thumb and forefinger, lifting her wide-eyed face to stare into the bottomless black eye holes of its mask. "You are a statue. You've seen us and become stone. And here you would remain with us forever," it sighed. "But it isn't time. You need to mother that brood of yours." It stroked a claw over her stomach. Her guts spun and gnawed on themselves to escape like rats. Her mouth quivered around the only word she could imagine. "But..." It tilted its head, letting its arms fall back inside the ruffling silks, closing them over the withered corpse beneath, letting the darkness dance in the gentle breeze blowing out to the snowy world behind. "Your mother?" It smirked behind the mask as the shadows surrounded Julia. "Your mother's here with us." The robes parted, shifting like sea currents, but instead of the grey husk, there was a wall of night. "See?" Trembling eyes looked away from the golden mask, staring into the liquid night as something pale bled through, coming closer and clearer with each second. Her mother's pale, naked body emerged, bobbing on the rippling surface like she were floating in water, uncaring of the pull to the floor. It was her. It was her mother. But it wasn't. The outline was right, the features were right, but she wasn't whole. She was a bloated, yellow, sagging corpse. Her swollen blue eyes looked out like milky glass, staring blindly into the white world. Her fat neck was black and purple from the rope that nearly embedded itself into her flesh, distorted like an old tattoo. "She's here!" Her mother's mouth moved, and 100 others came with her. Julia stepped back, eyes wide and heart pounding, limbs throbbing as they dripped blood onto the jade floor. "She's with us! All you lost are with us!" Her mother's corpse smiled and tilted her head, basking in the wall of black water. "All the broken and screaming mouths are here, all the blind eyes and deaf ears, all the fleeing feet and fighting hands, all the faces and hearts. We're here, Julia." Hot tears traced Julia's face as cracked, dry lips peeled over her teeth in a silent sob. She shook her head, brows knit and voice a hoarse whisper. "No, no, 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 no." "Yes, Jules," her mother's bloated corpse said, eyes blindly forward, grinning. "We're here, and the fighting's done. We're not mad anymore, not sad anymore. A milky tear traced her leathery cheek, falling back into the black water. "What are you?" Julia asked, other foot going back, mouth wide in a gasp, teeth bared as salty tears fell over her lips. Her knees buckled under her in a silent sob, making her bow as she stared at her mother's rotten face. "We're together," her mother said with a choir of voices. But the corpse sank back into the black as the robes closed, word finished by the thing. "We're not ready for you yet, Julia." She looked back up at the golden mask, the bottomless eyes, the hungry grin. Her blood ran cold as the wind outside, the aching burn pulsing in her hands and feet, gnawing up her limbs and throbbing behind her eyes. "Return home and raise your boys. We're not going anywhere." It knelt in front of her and chuckled, with a tilt of its head as Julia stepped back to the threshold and beyond, foot falling on a lumpy frozen thing. She looked down and stared, face contorting around wide eyes as she found blue-brown corpses frozen and knitted together beyond the doors, flat and woven like a grisly mosaic. "Don't worry, daughter. We'll be here when it's your time." Her wide eyes stayed glued to the floor of corpses, dried husks bound by cold, weight, and time. "We're patient. We'll wait as we've waited for 100 years. "Run, Jules!" her mother's voice screamed in her mind. "Run, and don't look back!" She spun and bolted, pounded dead, broken, bloody feet over the floor of the white world, the twisted, matted corpses leaving crimson tracks spraying behind her. Her mother's sunken, shriveled face screamed behind her teary eyes, voice mingling with Julia's sobs and distant screams. It told her to run and never stop, to fight and kill and survive and run, to run and run and run. She tripped over a mummified hand sticking out of the thin carpet of snow and pushed herself back up, panting, lungs burning, the cold shutting up the pain in her dead limbs to run harder. "We love you, Julia! You and your family!" the thing called with her own voice over the winds and her gasping sobs. "We've cherished you all for centuries. You'll not be left alone!" She screamed, tears freezing on her face as she ran, racing past the crater where her mother lay, twisted with the rest of the dead. Climbing up the hill she first rolled down as the wind howled and grabbed at her. She yelled, dead arms whirling around, bleeding lips peeled over chattering teeth to push the invisible things in the wind away. She fought the urge to spin, to fall beneath tired, numb legs, and pushed past the black boulder until the sky was a spiderweb of black lightning. But it didn't reach as high, and its spindly branches were shrinking, weaving the fabric of the white world back together and leaving a grey sky behind. She gulped air like knives and ran, shouting, blood rushing until her whole body ached with a pulsing throb. Closer and closer, the black jagged mouth of the dark place yawned, ever smaller. She yelled, fire filling her eyes as her body fell into the warm, steaming darkness and flew over the firm floor of the water. She panted, leaving the light behind her, gulping breath as the warmth seeped into her flesh and woke it up with needles, then knives, then teeth. She screamed as flesh sloughed off her bones, as pale mist arced around her, filling the air with dead wings. She screamed, tears flying behind her as meat and sinew fell away from the black frozen rot. The world trembled as she ran. The air shook, and she cried over the pain in her hands and feet, in her ears, in her head, in her chest. The ground rolled in a slow wave, and the worms screamed somewhere beside her in the darkness. She ran deeper into the gloom, until the closing maw of the wintry world was like a star, running the way she'd come back to the room and the door that should be there. But there was no reason to it, no logic. "None of this makes any sense," she thought. "There will be a door. I'm going home." The worm screeched and the floor turned into mountainous waves, rising and falling in slow motion as she crossed the void, panting, shouting, heart aching as it skipped beat after beat, lungs burning, hands and feet uselessly flopping with each stride. She blinked against the tug of unconsciousness. If the world were blurring, she couldn't see it for the darkness, and shook her head, biting her cheek, peeling back her broken lips and forging forward with the surge of electric pain. A little light glimmered in the distance, rushing toward her. She looked over her shoulder, and the cracks to the white world still glimmered behind her. Whirling back around, the distant warm light flew like a bird, like a dart, hurling itself at her over the dark waters, casting them up in an arching wake. The worm cried, long and deep and close. Its head crashed somewhere beside her, lurching up the floor, smacking her in the back and launching her into the air with wide eyes and a scream. She arced through the darkness, limbs flapping uselessly as she gasped against the rush of wind. She narrowed her eyes on the light, her orbits pricking, burning as it rushed up to meet her with a crack on the air. She looked over her shoulder and screamed at the 4 open jaws of the worm that reached for her with their rows of hooked black teeth. The world slowed as its tongue slithered from its throat on a low groan. Then light exploded in front of her, burning in the wet, drooling mouth and making the beast scream, its 1,000 black eyes closing as it lurched its head away. Julia turned and found the warm light, shaped like a missile, like an eagle or an angel, its skin made of shifting, muddled shapes that were too familiar. It unfurled wings from its breast, and campfire light became the sun, blasting her with wind and fire and light, filling the darkness with rainbows that swam like rivers of gasoline. It crashed into her without a cry or grunt and wrapped its wings round her, burning her, searing her skin, charring her hair, consuming her to the bone. She fell through its feathers, through its breast and light and fire, and hurtled through an ether of swimming light. She rolled and flew and fell, crashing onto an invisible floor as muddled shapes aligned, fitting together like blurry half-images until they finally made sense. A floor, walls, ceiling, furniture, a bed. The box. She rolled on the hardwood and slammed into her body, the door crashing into her back as her eyes flew open and she gasped. She jumped up, wide, wild eyes looking over the dim light of dusk through the window. She sat up and looked at her hands, her feet, felt her face and shut her eyes with a breathy sigh when they were all still there and in one piece. She grabbed her chest, breathing through her nostrils as she sat straight and leaned her head on the door, eyes cracking open on the shut lid of her mother's box. She swallowed and her hand slid to her stomach, rubbing, holding it and the twins inside, the twins only her husband knew about. She sat forward, hand hovering beneath her chin and heart sinking, unfurling like the last flower of a dying tree and vomiting its bitter perfume. Her eyes welled over. She clapped her hand over her mouth, killing the sob as her eyes fell shut, filled with her mother's shrunken, mummified face. "Mum," she breathed. "Mummy, what did you do?" She opened her eyes on the box and pulled her feet close, hugging her legs against her chest as another sob racked her. She jumped and spun, looking up at the door before she found the shadow coming from beneath. "Jules!" Her brother's voice came through the door, gentle and whispered. "You still in there?" She snivelled, wiping her face as she cleared her throat. "Yeah." Her voice was hoarse, like she'd screamed for hours. "Stupid question. You all right?" She sputtered a laugh. "What do you think, idiot?" "I said it was a stupid question." He sighed. "Look, you were the closest with Mum. I don't want to make things worse, but I know this is... Look, you're not alone, okay? I know. Can you just sort off and let me deal? He waited in silence for a long moment, then patted the door. Can I just sit quietly out here then? Why? He chuckled, but there was something else there. Something desperate on his breath. 'Cause I'm not okay either. Alright? She sighed, eyes falling to his shadow as he shuffled nervously. He turned around, voice coming like breath. Never mind. Just know you're not alone, yeah? You got me, and I'm sure your husband will be of some help. He laughed sadly. She stood and unlocked the door before his shadow could move on. She grabbed his wrist. He looked over his shoulder, white button-up creased and wrinkled, sleeves rolled haphazardly to the elbow, and hem hanging untucked over his black slacks. I know I'm not alone, stupid. She pulled him into her arms, and he wrapped himself around her, sighing against her hair. Neither are you. I just needed a minute, yeah? She sighed and rubbed his back, pulling them apart as silent tears welled in the corners of her eyes. He cupped her face and clenched his jaw, his eyes burning in the dim light as they slowly turned to stone and steel, pain set aside. He wiped her tears away and smiled sadly. Were you going through Mum's stuff? She looked over her shoulder at the box and back to him as he peeked inside. Yeah. Good and bad memories. You wanna... She motioned in with her head. So long as you don't mind seeing your big brother cry a little. She smirked and led him inside, leaving the door open as she bent to pick up the box. A little bit? Johnny, I saw your breakup with Martha. You ugly cried in your room for 3 days. Your dignity set sail a long time ago. She set the box on the vanity, turning the latch toward the mirror and pressing it flush. He chuckled and hummed. Still smells like Mum's drugs in here. She looked over her shoulder with raised eyebrows. You knew about it? He nodded. Always wondered what they were. She spun and vomited a laughing sigh. Do not try them. His smirk grew into a devilish smile as he laughed and pocketed his hands, whispering, So that's what you were doing in here, eh? Don't judge. Just trust me, they're messed up. We're here, Julia, her mother's bloated face said, floating in the robes of that thing in the hall. We're patient. We'll wait as we've waited for 100 years. Worst trip of my life, she chuckled. I don't even know if it was a trip, to be honest. He laughed. What, like it was real? You talked with God or something? His smile faded the longer he watched her unchanging face. You'll not be alone. The gold mask rushed at her behind her eyes, black eye holes staring, red teeth smiling and hungry. Or something. You wanna, I don't know, tell me about it? He asked, stepping closer, half bowing to look at her face. She eyed him, setting her mouth as she crossed her arms. I know you're in therapy and talking's great, but not now, yeah? She sighed and looked at the door, hands rubbing her arms as phantom fire danced through her fingers like they were still black and frozen. Maybe later? Yeah. Yeah, maybe later.